In a quiet town where the air always smelled faintly of pine and the sunsets seemed to last forever, one man's journey of pain, loss, and redemption was about to unfold in the most unexpected way. Jack Turner, a retired police officer, thought he had seen all of life's harshest blows until the day his best friend, his loyal Pitbull Max, was lost to a fire that would change everything. But fate has a way of surprising us, and sometimes the most broken souls find their way back to each other. Watch until the end to witness the heartwarming story of love that knows no boundaries, and a lesson that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if this story touched your heart, and join us as we discover the true meaning of second chances. The early morning mist curled around the narrow streets of Eldermount, a quiet town where time seemed to move a little slower and memories clung to every brick and corner. Jack Turner walked those streets alone, as he did every morning for the past year. At 67 years old, Jack's tall frame had started to stoop, and the once steady rhythm of his steps had grown hesitant. His silver hair glistened under the pale light of dawn, and deep lines marked his weathered face, each one a silent witness to a lifetime of battles fought and lost, of joys too fleeting and griefs too enduring. Eldermount had been his home for almost 5 decades, a place where everybody knew everybody, where summer fairs lit up the town square, and winters brought the smell of wood smoke and pies cooling on windowsills. But for Jack, the town had changed. Without Max, the streets felt emptier, colder. His modest house on Maple Street, once filled with the thump of a wagging tail and soft snores by the fireplace, now echoed with a hollow silence that gnawed at him day and night. Max had been more than just a dog. He had been Jack's partner, his shadow, his family. Years ago, when Jack's only son, Michael, died in a tragic accident overseas, Max had been the anchor that kept Jack from drifting away into despair. A sturdy pit bull with a heart bigger than his broad chest, Max had been trained as a 9 officer. Side by side with Jack, they had faced danger together, trusted each other in ways that defied words. Max had been there through the darkest nights, the loneliest days, offering a silent companionship that asked for nothing and gave everything. And then, 1 year ago, the fire, the memory of it burned as vividly in Jack's mind, as if it had happened yesterday. A call had come through an apartment blaze on the east side of town. Without hesitation, Jack and Max had rushed in. Like they had countless times before, they had helped evacuate 3 families trapped inside, their lungs filling with smoke, their bodies trembling with fear. Max had been a hero, darting through the thick haze, leading a little girl by the sleeve to safety. But then, amidst the confusion and chaos, a beam had collapsed. Jack remembered the deafening crack of wood splitting, the scream that tore from his throat as Max pushed him clear, only to disappear beneath a wave of smoke and debris. When the fire was finally controlled and the ruins searched, there was no sign of Max, no body, no trace, just a heavy, suffocating absence that wrapped itself around Jack's heart. At first, Jack clung to hope. Maybe Max had escaped. Maybe he was just lost, hurt but alive. He spent days searching the woods, the shelters, knocking on doors, asking strangers, but hope, like everything else, eventually ran thin. The town grieved with him in their quiet way. Friends left casseroles at his doorstep. Neighbors offered tight hugs and solemn nods. But nothing could fill the gaping hole Max had left behind. Jack tried to move on, but moving on felt like betrayal. Some nights he would sit on the front porch, an old quilt wrapped around his shoulders, staring into the night, listening for the jingle of a collar, the soft padding of paws on the path. But the nights remained silent, as did his house, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to mock the endless passage of time. Every morning, Jack walked the same path through Eldermount, past the bakery that still displayed dog biscuits in the window, past the park, where he and Max had played endless games of fetch. Some mornings he imagined he saw Max's sturdy silhouette trotting ahead, just out of reach. Other mornings he barely had the strength to lift his feet, but he walked anyway, carrying a grief that had become as much a part of him as his own shadow. The seasons shifted. The fiery leaves of autumn gave way to the stark white of winter, then to the tentative greens of spring. But inside Jack, time stood still. The walls of his home remained adorned with photographs. Jack in uniform, Max by his side, both proud, both strong. A younger Jack, grinning as a tiny Pitbull puppy clambered onto his chest. A middle-aged Jack, a little more gray, tossing a worn-out tennis ball to an eager Max at the lake. He spoke to Max sometimes, in the quiet moments, asked him how he was doing, told him about the day's news, complained about the ache in his knees. He laughed softly at himself, knowing some might call him crazy, but Jack didn't care. Talking to Max made the silence a little less sharp. Still, beneath it all, Jack clung stubbornly to a sliver of belief, a whisper of hope that somewhere, somehow, Max was still out there, that fate, or God, or something he couldn't name, had not finished writing their story. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was the desperate delusion of a lonely old man. But Jack Turner, who had faced down danger and darkness, who had survived losses that should have broken him, refused to let go. On this particular morning, with the fog curling low over the sidewalks and the sun just beginning to stain the sky with the faintest blush of pink, Jack's steps led him, as they often did, toward Eldermount Rescue Shelter, a small, worn-out building on the edge of town, its paint peeling, its windows fogged from the chill, a place where the forgotten and broken waited for another chance. Jack didn't know it yet, but today would not be like the other mornings. Today, a chapter long thought closed was about to reopen, in a way that would change everything he believed about love, loyalty, and miracles. And it all began with a single, desperate cry from the far end of the shelter. The bell above the door jingled softly. As Jack pushed his way into the Eldermount Rescue Shelter, the warmth inside was a small comfort against the chilly morning air. The familiar scent of cleaning supplies, old wood and wet fur filled the space, oddly soothing in its own way. It was a modest shelter-chipped paint on the walls, a coffee machine that rattled whenever it brewed, but it was a place full of second chances. And lately, Jack had found himself needing those second chances more than ever. Emily Sanders looked up from behind the reception desk, offering him a warm smile. She was in her late 20s, with curly brown hair always tied in a messy bun and a kindness in her eyes that had made Jack feel welcome from the very first day he had wandered in, looking for a way to quiet the ache inside him. "Morning, Mr. Turner," she called, setting down a stack of paperwork. "Glad you're here early? We've got a new arrival, and he's going to need all the patience we can give." Jack hung his coat on the wall hook, his curiosity piqued. "What's the story?" Emily's smile faltered slightly. She walked around the desk, lowering her voice. "Came in late last night. A pit bull. Young, but you can tell he's been through hell. He was rescued during that raid on the dog fighting ring outside town." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had seen too many animals broken by cruelty, and the thought of it never got any easier. "He's in rough shape," Emily continued, leading Jack down the long hallway toward the back kennels. "Won't let anyone near him. Won't eat. Barely moves. Just hides in the corner and shakes." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Honestly, I don't know if he'll come back from this." Jack nodded grimly. He knew too well how deep wounds could bury themselves under the skin, in places no medicine could reach. The farther they walked, the quieter it became. The usual chorus of barks and whines faded until only the faint hum of the old heating vents remained. Emily stopped in front of the last kennel on the left. Inside, huddled against the back wall, was the dog. Jack's heart clenched at the sight. The pit bull was painfully thin, ribs clearly visible beneath patchy fur. Scars crisscrossed his body, old and new, a brutal map of suffering. His head was tucked low, his body trembling uncontrollably. His tail lay still, limp against the concrete floor. Emily sighed. "He won't let anyone get close. I tried sitting with him, talking softly, but he just curls tighter into himself." Jack stared at the dog, something stirring in the deepest part of him. He stepped forward slowly, dropping into a crouch several feet away from the kennel gate. He said nothing at first, simply breathing slow and steady, letting the dog get used to his presence. The pit bull barely moved, only flickering his eyes toward Jack for the briefest moment before turning his head away again. Jack sat there in silence for a long time, longer than most would have had the patience for, and then, almost without thinking, he began to hum a low, gentle tune that carried softly through the cold air. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." It was an old song, one Jack had sung to Max countless times after long shifts, during thunderstorms, or simply when the weight of the world felt too heavy. It had been their song. Jack's voice was rough from disuse, but the melody wove through the quiet hall like a golden thread. At first, there was no reaction, and then, slowly, the pit bull's ears twitched. Jack kept singing, barely above a whisper, "You make me happy when skies are gray." The pit bull lifted his head slightly, eyes squinting toward Jack, as if trying to place a long-forgotten memory. Jack dared not move, dared not even breathe too loud. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you." The change was almost imperceptible, a shift in the dog's breathing, the faintest lift in his trembling frame. His eyes, once glassy with fear, began to glisten with something else. Recognition, longing, hope. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The pit bull let out a soft, broken whimper, a sound so raw and full of emotion that Jack felt his own eyes sting with tears. Slowly, agonizingly, the dog began to crawl forward, not with the frantic, panicked energy of a cornered animal, but with a hesitant, desperate need. His paws scraped against the concrete, leaving faint trails as he dragged himself closer to the gate separating him from the man whose voice had awakened something deep inside him. Emily stood frozen behind Jack, her hands pressed to her mouth, unable to believe what she was seeing. The pit bull inched forward until his nose touched the gate. His tail, so long still, gave a single, trembling wag. Jack dropped his head, overwhelmed by the surge of emotion crashing over him. His hands shook as he pressed them against the bars. "Max?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The dog let out another soft cry, pressing his battered body as close to Jack's hands as the metal allowed. It was him. Somehow, impossibly, it was him. Jack didn't know how it was possible. He didn't know how Max had survived, how he had ended up in this place, so broken and scarred. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was the soul behind those familiar brown eyes. The soul he had thought he lost forever was looking back at him now. Jack leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the gate, closing his eyes as a tear slid down his cheek. "I'm here, boy," he whispered, his voice shaking with the weight of 1,000 yesterdays. "I'm here. I never stopped looking for you." Behind him, Emily wiped her own tears away, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. "I've never seen anything like this," she said softly. "It's like he remembered you." Jack gave a broken laugh, one filled with awe and aching gratitude. "He didn't remember me," Jack said, opening his eyes to meet Max's gaze. "He never forgot." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack felt a fragile, breathtaking thing spark to life inside his chest. Hope. Jack sat on the cold concrete floor outside Max's kennel, his back pressed against the wall, hands trembling in his lap. He couldn't take his eyes off the battered pit bull before him, who stared back with a mixture of hope and heartbreak. In Max's eyes, Jack saw not just the scars of the past year, but the remnants of a bond that even time and cruelty had failed to erase. As Jack reached through the kennel bars to brush the tips of his fingers against Max's fur, memories began to flood him, vivid and relentless. It had been 1 year since that terrible morning when the fire had taken everything. Jack had believed that Max had died in the chaos, crushed beneath the weight of collapsing beams. In those first desperate days afterward, Jack had clung to hope with everything he had. Friends and neighbors had searched with him, combing through shelters, checking veterinary clinics, posting flyers across Eldermount and beyond. But the leads had dried up, and silence had closed in like a tomb. Jack had tried to convince himself that Max was at peace, that at least he was no longer suffering. It had been the only way to survive the endless nights, the endless guilt gnawing at him. But now seeing Max alive, Seeing the brokenness in his body and soul, Jack realized the truth was far worse than he could have imagined. Max hadn't died that day. He had survived, only to face a different kind of hell. Later that morning, as Emily brought a cup of coffee to Jack's side and sat with him, she shared what little she knew. The authorities had raided a dogfighting operation 2 towns over. Among the animals rescued was a Pitbull, who matched Max's description: malnourished, covered in wounds both old and fresh, and deeply traumatized. He had been passed from one temporary shelter to another until he ended up at Eldermount. The pieces clicked together painfully in Jack's mind. After the fire, in the chaos and confusion, a group posing as animal rescuers had taken Max. They had likely lied to the firefighters, lied to everyone, and disappeared before anyone realized something was wrong. For Jack, overwhelmed with grief and smoke inhalation, it had been too easy to believe they were there to help. He should have questioned it. He should have followed them. He should have done more. Lara min fai tim. Timwak? No. Minhea that hua roy, Jack muttered under his breath, the words a harsh whip across his conscience. Max had trusted him to keep him safe. And Jack had failed. His hand clenched tightly around the coffee cup, the paper crinkling under the pressure. His throat ached with the effort of holding back tears. He had always prided himself on protecting those he loved, whether it was his family, his fellow officers, or the dogs who had served alongside him. But in the moment it had mattered most. He had been too broken, too blinded by grief to see the truth. Max had suffered because of it. As Jack looked at him now, the reality of Max's ordeal carved itself deep into his soul. The scars marring Max's body were brutal and numerous. Jagged lines across his shoulders, puncture marks on his legs, patches where the fur would never grow back. But even more devastating were the scars. Jack couldn't see the ones carved into Max's spirit. Jack could see it in the way Max flinched when a shadow moved too quickly, in the way he kept one eye on every exit, his body always half-coiled, ready to flee if necessary. Trust did not come easy anymore. Safety was not something Max took for granted. And yet, through all of it, Max had remembered him. Through pain, fear, betrayal, he had held on to the memory of Jack, like a lifeline, like a whispered prayer in the dark. Jack leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against the cold metal bars. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I'm sorry, boy," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I should have found you. I should have never let you go," Max whined softly in response, pressing his scarred nose closer to Jack's hand, seeking comfort, offering forgiveness without hesitation. Tears blurred Jack's vision. How could this dog, after everything humans had done to him, still have the capacity for love? It was a kind of love that knew no conditions, no limits, no expiration dates. It was a love that endured even when reason said it should have died. It was a love Jack knew he didn't deserve, but would spend the rest of his days honoring. He thought back to the nights he had spent sitting alone on his porch, whispering into the dark, telling Max about his day, telling the empty air how much he missed him. Some part of him must have known, must have hoped that Max could still hear him, across whatever distance or barrier had separated them. And maybe, in a way, Max had. Maybe love left a trail stronger than any leash, brighter than any beacon. Maybe Max had followed that invisible thread all the way back to him. Jack lifted his head and met Max's gaze, heart pounding with a fierce, protective resolve. "You're home now," he said, his voice steady despite the tears sliding down his cheeks. "And nothing is ever going to hurt you again." Max let out a low, contented whine and pressed his body fully against the gate, his scars and pain momentarily forgotten in the presence of the man he had waited for through a year of nightmares. Jack sat there, stroking his battered friend through the bars, knowing that healing would take time, that scars might fade but never truly disappear. But for the first time in a long, long time, he also knew something else. They had both been broken, but together they would be whole again. The moments after Jack and Max found each other were a blur of raw emotion. Jack sat there for what felt like forever, his hand pressed through the bars, feeling the warm, ragged breaths of the dog. He thought he had lost forever. Around them, the world faded into a soft, distant hum. It was just Jack and Max, two battered souls reconnecting across the scars of time and pain. But as the initial rush of reunion slowly ebbed into reality, a different kind of weight settled on Jack's shoulders. Emily shifted uneasily beside him, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. She cleared her throat gently, a hesitant sound that broke the fragile bubble around them. "Mist Turner," she said softly. "I wish it were as easy as just walking out of here with him today." Jack turned his head slowly, still kneeling beside the kennel, his hand never leaving Max's fur. His eyes, still damp with emotion, narrowed slightly in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked. Though somewhere deep down, he already knew. Emily winced. By law, Max is considered property of the shelter now. Technically, he has to go through the standard adoption process, application, background check, waiting period, the whole thing. Jack stared at her, the words bouncing around in his mind, struggling to stick. Adoption process? Waiting? Background checks? After everything they had been through, after a year of heartbreak and hopelessness, some stack of paperwork was going to stand between him and his boy. His fingers tightened in Max's fur. Max, sensing his rising tension, pressed his body closer to the gate. Letting out a low, anxious whine, Jack took a slow, shaky breath, trying to steady the storm that had erupted inside him. But the anger, the fear, it was too much. He rose to his feet, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "I am not leaving him again," Jack said, his voice low but burning with an intensity that made Emily take a small step back. Not for one night. Not for 1 hour. Emily opened her mouth, perhaps to explain, to apologize. But Jack wasn't done. "Damn the forms," he growled. "Damn the system. If I have to fight through every piece of red tape between here and the Capitol building, I will, but I am not walking out of here without him. I lost him once. I will not lose him again." The passion in his voice cracked through the stale air like a whip. Emily blinked rapidly, her throat working as she swallowed the lump rising there. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Max lay pressed against the gate, watching Jack with wide, trusting eyes, as if he understood every word. Finally, Emily set down her clipboard and wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "I get it," she whispered. "Believe me, I do." She knelt down beside Jack, reaching through the bars to gently scratch behind Max's ears. The dog shuddered under her touch, but didn't pull away. "You two," Emily said softly, shaking her head with wonder. "I have never seen anything like it. He remembers you. He never gave up on you." Jack's throat tightened painfully. "Neither did I," he thought but could not say. Emily stood up, taking a deep breath, the kind someone takes before making a choice they know will change everything. "Okay," she said, finally. "There are rules, but there are also exceptions, special cases." She offered Jack a tentative smile. "You're about the most special case I've ever seen," Jack frowned, not daring to hope. "What does that mean?" Emily's smile grew stronger. "It means if you fill out some paperwork, answer a few questions, and let me make a few phone calls, Max can go home with you today." For a heartbeat, Jack just stood there, stunned. Then the words broke through, crashing into his heart with the force of a tidal wave. Today, not in a week, not in a month. Today. His knees gave out, and he dropped back into a crouch beside Max, wrapping both arms through the kennel bars to hold the trembling dog as close as he could. "You hear that, boy?" Jack murmured, his voice thick with tears. "You're coming home," Max whined softly, resting his scarred head against Jack's arm. Emily moved quickly then, gathering forms, making calls, waving off skeptical supervisors with a determination that matched Jack's own. She explained the situation in careful, urgent words, emphasizing the miracle, the undeniable bond, the fact that separating them again would do more harm than any rule ever intended to prevent. As Jack filled out the necessary forms with a hand that shook from more than just age, he stole glances at Max, marveling at the resilience in those battered eyes. His boy had been through hell, had fought to survive, when no one would have blamed him for giving up, had held on to the memory of Jack like a lighthouse through endless storms. Jack's emotions swelled until it felt like his chest could hardly contain them. Relief, guilt, overwhelming love, all tangled together in a knot that refused to loosen. He had found his son again. No force on earth would tear them apart now. As Emily handed him the final form to sign, she smiled through tears of her own. "Welcome home, Max Turner," she said softly. Jack looked down at Max, who gazed up at him with unwavering trust. "Yeah," Jack said, his voice steady with a fierce, unbreakable love. "Welcome home, son." Bringing Max home felt like a miracle, but Jack quickly realized that miracles came wrapped in hard work, patience, and sometimes heartbreak. Max was not the same eager young dog who used to bound around the house with a toy in his mouth and joy in his eyes. This Max was a shadow, a trembling soul, stitched together by scars and memories, too dark for Jack to fully understand. The first night back in the house was both beautiful and painful. Jack laid out Max's old bed by the fireplace, the same spot it had always been, as if waiting for him to return. Max sniffed it hesitantly, his body low to the ground, ears pinned back. He circled it once, twice, then collapsed onto the worn blanket with a sigh so heavy it made Jack's heart ache. Jack stayed up late that night, sitting in his armchair, watching over Max like a guardian angel too scared to blink. For a while, Max slept peacefully, his body finally able to relax, but sometime in the early hours, the nightmares came. It started with a whimper, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Then Max's legs twitched violently. He let out a low, panicked growl, followed by a heart-wrenching yelp that tore Jack out of his chair before he even knew he was moving. Jack knelt beside him, gently placing his hand on Max's side, feeling the wild hammering of the dog's heart beneath his scarred ribs. Max jolted awake, disoriented, his eyes wide and glassy with fear. "It's okay, boy," Jack whispered, his voice soft and steady. "You're safe now. You're home." Without thinking, Jack did the one thing he had always done when the world became too much for both of them. He sang, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." At the sound of the familiar melody, Max's trembling slowed, his breathing eased. Slowly, he lowered his head back onto the bed, pressing his nose into Jack's palm. Jack stayed by his side until the sun rose, humming quietly, never letting go. The nights that followed were much the same. Jack kept a quilt folded on the floor next to Max's bed and slept there, his old joints protesting but his heart refusing to be anywhere else. Some nights, Max would wake Jack up with frantic whimpers, his paws scrambling against the floor as if trying to run from something only he could see. Jack would wrap his arms around the shivering Pitbull, holding him close, rocking gently back and forth until the fear passed. During the days, Jack worked to rebuild trust in the small, ordinary moments. He spoke to Max constantly, telling him about the weather, about the neighbor's mischievous cat, about the garden that refused to grow tomatoes this year. He didn't expect Max to understand the words, but he knew Max could understand the love in them. Max was skittish with sudden sounds. The slamming of a door would send him scuttling under the table. A drop pan would cause him to freeze, his body rigid with fear. Jack learned to move slower, to soften his steps and lower his voice, even more than usual. Progress was measured not in days, but in glimmers. The first time Max wagged his tail, it was so slight Jack almost missed it, a timid twitch at the tip. When Jack walked into the room with a bowl of food, Jack had to turn away quickly, blinking back tears he didn't want Max to see. A week later, Max let Jack brush his fur for the first time. The old dog flinched at the initial touch, but, little by little, leaned into it, releasing a shaky sigh as Jack ran the brush gently along his back. But the moment that broke Jack's heart wide open came one crisp morning, as autumn painted the trees outside in fiery reds and golds. Jack was sitting on the porch steps, sipping his coffee, the early sunlight spilling across the yard. Max wandered over, his movements cautious but no longer fearful. Jack kept still, not wanting to startle him. And then, without any prompting, Max pressed his head firmly against Jack's knee and sighed a deep, contented sound that spoke volumes. Jack set his coffee aside with shaking hands and lowered himself to the step, cradling Max's broad head in his hands. "Hey there, sunshine," he whispered, a smile cracking through the sadness that had lived on his face for so long. Max's tail thumped once, twice against the wooden floorboards. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a dramatic reunion filled with music and fireworks. It was something quieter, deeper, a silent promise whispered between two souls, battered by the world, but undefeated. Jack realized then that love didn't always roar or blaze like a bonfire. Sometimes love whispered. Sometimes it took the form of patience, of soft songs in the night, of hands that never gave up, reaching out even when they were met with fear. Healing wasn't about forgetting the scars. It was about living beyond them, together. In the weeks that followed, the house slowly began to fill with life again. Jack laughed out loud the first time Max pounced clumsily on his old squeaky toy, startling himself when it let out a honk. They took short walks around the block, Max's steps tentative but growing bolder each day. Neighbors who hadn't seen Jack smile in months started to wave again. Children pointed and laughed when Max tried to catch falling leaves with his mouth. The empty shell of Jack's life cracked open, and light began to seep in. Max had come home, and so had Jack. News in a small town like Eldermount traveled fast. But sometimes, when the right story found the right heart, it traveled even faster than anyone could have imagined. It started one crisp Saturday morning when a local newspaper reporter, wandering past the park with her coffee in hand, spotted something she couldn't ignore. There, sitting on a worn bench under the golden leaves of a maple tree, was an elderly man and a scarred pit bull. The man hummed softly, a coffee cup balanced on the bench arm, while the dog leaned heavily against his leg, eyes closed in complete, vulnerable trust. It was a simple scene, easy to overlook except for the way the two seemed stitched together by something invisible and unbreakable. Curious, the reporter approached, struck up a conversation, and heard the story Jack had shared with only a few close friends until then. The fire, the loss, the year of emptiness, the impossible reunion. She scribbled furiously into her notepad, her heart pounding faster with every word Jack spoke. By Monday morning, the headline stretched across the front page of the Eldermount Gazette: "The Lost Soldier and His Faithful Pitbull, a story of love, survival, and second chances." The story spread like wildfire. Local television stations picked it up, then regional news. Before the week was out, national networks were calling, asking for interviews, for photographs, for a glimpse into the miracle that had captured so many hearts. Jack, never one for the spotlight, agreed only because Emily gently reminded him how many others they could help by telling it, and help it did. Across the country, something began to shift. Shelters reported a sudden surge in inquiries about pitbull adoptions. Families who had once passed by kennels without a second glance now stopped, looked closer, and asked questions. They no longer saw just the muscle and the rumors of aggression. They saw Max's face, the battered survivor who still chose to trust, to love, to hope. Here in Eldermount, the change was even more profound. Inspired by Jack and Max's story, the shelter launched a new initiative called Adopt Don't Judge, aimed specifically at challenging stereotypes about pit bulls and other so-called dangerous breeds. Posters went up around town featuring Max's soulful eyes and the tagline, "Every heart deserves a second chance." Community members donated supplies, volunteers poured in, and within 2 months, the shelter saw more adoptions than it had in the entire previous year. But perhaps the most powerful moment, the one that stayed with Jack long after the cameras and reporters moved on, came one quiet afternoon in the town square. Jack was sitting with Max on the grass, enjoying the rare warmth of a late autumn sun. Children ran nearby, laughing and tossing leaves into the air. Max watched them with calm interest, his tail occasionally tapping the ground. From the corner of his eye, Jack noticed a young girl standing alone, a few feet away. She clung tightly to her mother's hand, her small face pale with fear. The mother knelt beside her, whispering something encouraging, but the girl shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. Jack recognized the look, fear so big it eclipsed everything else. He gave Max a soft pat and said, almost as if confiding a secret, "You up for a little magic, boy?" Max's ears twitched. He stayed still, sitting tall and steady, radiating patience. Tentatively, the mother guided her daughter forward. Jack spoke gently, introducing Max and explaining how he had once been scared too, scared of loud noises, of sudden movements, of strange new things. He told her that Max had learned to be brave a little bit at a time, and that bravery, like love, grew when given the chance. Finally, trembling, the girl extended a tiny hand. Max, sensing her hesitation, leaned forward slowly, lowering his head until his scarred nose brushed her fingers. He stayed completely still, letting her take the lead. The girl gasped a small sound of wonder, and then, with a bright smile breaking across her face, she began to stroke his soft fur. Max closed his eyes, his tail sweeping a gentle rhythm across the grass. The mother wiped away tears she didn't try to hide. Jack's heart swelled so fiercely he thought it might burst. In that moment, he understood something he hadn't dared believe before. The love he and Max shared, their bond forged through loss, loyalty, and a stubborn refusal to give up, was not theirs alone. It was a gift, a light shining outward, breaking down fear, softening hardened hearts, reminding people that even the most broken souls could still love, still trust, still heal. Max hadn't just saved Jack from loneliness. Together, they were saving others too, one frightened heart at a time. 1 year later, on a golden afternoon that seemed too perfect to be real, the town of Eldermount gathered in the small park at the center of town. Jack Turner stood near the old oak tree, Max at his side, watching as neighbors, families, and strangers alike slowly filled the open field with laughter and warmth. Jack had spent months planning this day, Friendship Remembrance Day. He called it not a day of sadness, but a day of honoring every soul, human and animal alike, who had loved and been loved in return. A day to celebrate bonds that time, distance, and even death could never truly break. Max wore a simple blue bandana around his neck, its fabric faded but clean, embroidered with the words, "Forever loved." His steps were slower now, his muzzle brushed with more gray, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. Every wag of his tail was a small miracle Jack never took for granted. Children darted between booths, where volunteers handed out free dog treats and balloons. Elderly couples strolled hand in hand. Rescue groups set up tents displaying photos of dogs and cats, still waiting for their second chance. Soft music drifted through the air, blending with the crisp scent of autumn leaves and fresh cider. As the sun dipped lower, bathing the world in a soft amber light, Jack stepped up to the small wooden stage set up by the town's carpenters. Max trotted beside him, never straying more than a few inches from his side. Jack took a slow breath, feeling the familiar weight of emotion gather in his chest. He looked out over the crowd, faces young and old, some familiar, some new, and then down at Max, who sat patiently at his feet. Looking up with unwavering trust, Jack smiled, lifting the microphone with hands that had steadied many lives, but trembled now with gratitude. 1 year ago, Jack began, his voice carrying across the hush that fell over the crowd. "I thought my story with Max had ended. I thought our chapter had closed forever, leaving only memories behind." He paused, swallowing hard against the lump rising in his throat. "But life," he continued, "has a funny way of surprising us. Sometimes, even when the pages seem torn and the ink has run dry, a new chapter finds its way into our hands." He glanced down at Max, whose tail thumped once against the stage floor. "I stand here today, not as a man who lost something, but as a man who found something even greater. I found proof that love doesn't end, that loyalty doesn't fade, that even the most broken hearts can mend when given the chance." Jack nodded toward the volunteers nearby, to the families hugging their newly adopted dogs, to the old friends reunited after years apart. "We can lose our youth. We can lose our health. We can even lose the whole world we once knew," he said, his voice growing stronger. "But if we still have love, pure, stubborn, unconditional love, then we have not truly lost anything at all." The speakers crackled softly, and then the first gentle notes of a familiar song floated into the air. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Jack's throat tightened. He lowered the microphone, reached down, and lifted Max gently into his arms. The dog nestled against him with a sigh, his eyes half closing in contentment. As the melody washed over them, the crowd swayed, some singing along, others simply closing their eyes, letting the simple, timeless tune soak into their bones. It was a lullaby not just for the living, but for every memory, every bond that refused to be forgotten. As the last notes faded into the twilight, Jack set Max back onto the grass. He gave a low whistle, and Max rose, steady and sure, by his side. Together, they began to walk slowly, deliberately through the crowd and toward the path leading home. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and a soft breeze rustled the trees overhead. The world felt wrapped in a warm, invisible embrace. As if the very earth itself honored their journey, Jack and Max moved forward as one, a little slower, a little grayer, but whole. And as they disappeared down the winding path, framed by the soft glow of the setting sun, their story whispered a promise to all who watched, that love once given freely never truly fades, that even the deepest wounds can heal, that sometimes, against all odds, the best endings are really just new beginnings. And somewhere, carried on the breeze like a gentle blessing, the melody drifted on, "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you." And so, after a year of heartache, struggle, and healing, Jack and Max proved that love truly conquers all. Their story became a beacon of hope, not just for them, but for anyone who has ever felt lost or alone. As Max sat by his side, his scars no longer just marks of pain, but badges of survival, Jack realized something profound. It's not the things we lose, but the love we give and receive that define us. In the end, we only regret the chances we didn't take. As the saying goes, this story is proof that no matter how broken you are, the courage to love again is always within reach. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how it made you feel. Remember to subscribe and be a part of our growing family, where every story we share has the power to inspire and change lives.